You know that feeling, right? When that envelope arrives in the mail, that annual property tax bill,
Oh, yeah.
and there's that little sigh you let out because you know it's this huge, unavoidable chunk of your budget. You pay it, of course, you have to. But I think what we're going to dig into today is that beneath that number on the page is a reality that is, well, it's just incredibly complex and really, really different all over the world.
It is. It's probably the single most important and yet I'd say the least understood mechanism for local finance anywhere.
Right.
What looks like this really simple charge on your home's value is actually this tangled web of, history, powerful economic tools, and some really different legal ideas depending on where you live.
Okay, so let's try and unpack that. Our mission for this deep dive is to get way beyond that annual bill. We're going to explore what property tax actually is, historically, legally, what it does in practice, and we've got a whole stack of sources here that show just how differently everyone approaches this idea of taxing the ground beneath our feet.
And just to, set the stage, the core definition we're working with is that property tax is an ad valorem tax.
Ad valorem. Latin, right.
Latin, yes. It just means based on value.
Yeah.
That is the absolute foundation for almost every system we're going to talk about. And crucially, it's not just one government taking a slice. It's really important to remember that you can have multiple jurisdictions, national, state, county, city, all of them can tax the very same property at the same time.
And the language they use can get pretty specific. I mean, we keep seeing this term millage or mill rate. Before we even get to the math, what exactly is a mill?
So a mill comes from the Latin word millésimum.
1,000th.
Exactly, 1,000th part. So 1 mill is simply 1,000th of a dollar or a euro or whatever currency you're using. The mill rate is just the tax you pay for every $1,000 of your property's value. It's a system designed to make these calculations manageable at the local level.
Okay, that helps cut through the jargon. So let's walk through it. How does that mill rate turn into the bill that I get? Can you give us the hard numbers?
Sure. Let's use a really clear example. Imagine your home is officially assessed, and assessment is the key word here. It's not always the same as market value at, say, $50,000.
Nope.
And your town sets a mill rate of 20 mills. To get your tax bill, you take the assessed value, the $50,000, you multiply it by the mill rate, which is 20, and then you just divide that whole thing by 1,000.
So 50,000 times 20, that's $1 million. Divide that by 1,000.
And there you go. Your property tax bill is $1,000 for the year.
$1,000. Okay.
It's a simple formula, but the key things for you, the listener, to remember are, 1, it's based on that assessed value, and 2, that 20 mills might actually be a combination of rates from the city, the county, the school district, all bundled together.
Now, when we say property, our sources show that tax authorities break this down into 4 broad types. Can we quickly define those? Because we're really only focusing on 2 of them for this deep dive.
Right. So legally, we're looking at 4 things. There's land. There are improvements to land. There's personal property.
Yeah.
And finally, intangible property.
Okay, walk me through those.
Land is, well, it's the bird itself. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
Improvements are all the man-made things stuck to the land that don't move. So buildings, driveways, that kind of thing.
Got it.
Personal property is the movable stuff. Machinery, equipment, sometimes even farm animals, though that's often handled differently now. And intangible property is non-physical stuff, stocks, patents. That's almost never part of a general property tax today.
And we're mostly focusing on what's called real property, the land plus the improvements, because let's be honest, that's where the money is.
Precisely. That combination is what most people think of as property, and it's what we'll be focusing on as we, travel the globe.
Okay, so we've got the baseline. We know what it is, how the mill rate works. Let's lay out the road ahead because we are covering a lot of ground. We're starting with these foundational policy ideas. Then we're going to jump around the world to look at some really different systems, from Canada's transaction-heavy model to what Hong Kong does, before we end with the, frankly, surprising history and some of the really deep philosophical criticisms of this whole idea.
And this is where it gets so interesting. You start to see that property tax isn't just about raising money. It becomes this powerful tool for social engineering and economic policy.
All right, jumping into Section 1, the foundations of property tax, or what are we actually taxing? The first thing that just jumps out from the sources is that to achieve those social goals you mentioned, authorities almost never tax everything the same. Classification is everything.
That's exactly right. Property is almost never taxed uniformly. It's classified by how it's used.
Yeah.
Residential, commercial, industrial, vacant land. And each of those categories is often taxed at a very different rate.
And that's not random.
No, not at all. It's a conscious policy choice about who or what kind of economic activity should be carrying more of the weight for funding city services.
So a city could decide, for example, that big office buildings get more benefit from, say, the subway system, so they should pay a higher rate than a single-family home. It's a way to shift the load around.
Exactly. And once you have that classification system, you can use the tax to do more than just raise money. You can actually try to influence behavior. And the most striking example of that is the vacancy tax.
Which sounds like a direct shot at a problem we see everywhere, right? Housing shortages in big cities. But at the same time, you have investors just sitting on empty apartments, treating them like a stock instead of a home.
It is a direct response to that market failure. If you're an owner and you're just sitting on a perfectly good, habitable apartment and keeping it empty, the government can use property tax to give you a very strong financial nudge to get that unit onto the market, either for rent or for sale.
And we got two really interesting specific examples of this in our sources, right? One from the Middle East, one from Europe.
First up, in Israel, the government just flat out imposes double the property tax rate on vacant apartments compared to occupied ones.
Double. That's a huge penalty.
It's a massive financial deterrent. It really forces the owner to do the math. Is it worth paying twice the tax just to keep this place empty? Or should I just rent it out and get that housing supply back online?
And then there's France, where they did something similar, and the sources say it actually worked.
Yeah, the French experience is a really strong case study. After they brought in their vacant property tax, they actually measured a 13% drop in the vacancy rate in the areas they targeted. So this isn't just, a theory. This is using a tax system that's centuries old to solve a very modern urban housing problem.
What's also fascinating is how the legal definition of the tax changes things.
Yeah.
When we talk about a general property tax, we mean it's based on fair market value. But there's this really important legal distinction with another kind of charge. The special assessment tax.
This distinction is so important because this is where a lot of the confusion and, frankly, the anger from homeowners comes from. They get a bill that looks like a property tax bill, but it's for something completely different.
So how are they different legally?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's all on my bill, what's the justification?
A special assessment tax is only levied because of a specific localized improvement or benefit to your property. Its legal justification is that benefit, not your home's overall market value. The government has to show that it's demonstrably making your property better or more useful.
Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Let's say the city decides to install a brand new sewer line on your block or put in new sidewalks and streetlights that directly serve your house. You'd pay a special assessment tax for that.
Oh, okay.
That tax pays for that specific project. It's totally separate from the general valorem property tax that funds the police, the fire department, the schools, and everything else.
Okay, so the general property tax pays for the fire department that serves the whole town. That's a collective good. But the special assessment pays for the brand new sidewalk right in front of my house. That's a targeted improvement just for my block.
Precisely. One is for the collective good. The other is for a specific, measurable benefit to your specific piece of land. They're justified on completely different legal grounds.
And finally, for this section, to really get what property tax is, we should probably contrast it with two other big ideas mentioned in the sources, the rent tax and the land value tax.
The rent tax is probably the easiest one to understand. It's a tax based purely on rental income, or what the imputed rent might be. You're taxing the money the property makes, not the value of the property itself.
So it shifted from a wealth tax to an income tax.
Exactly. A distinction we're going to see come to life when we talk about Hong Kong later on.
And then there's the land value tax, or LVT. And this is a much bigger and often politically charged idea.
LVT is a totally different philosophy. It says you should only tax the value of the bare land itself, and you should exclude the value of any improvements like buildings or landscaping.
Because under an LVT system, if I own a prime downtown lot, my tax bill is the same, whether I leave it as a parking lot or build a 40-story skyscraper on it.
Right. Proponents of LVT, who are often called Georgists, see it as a way to encourage development and kill land speculation. It separates the value that comes from the owner's investment, the building, from the value that comes from society and nature, the location. This contrast is really important because a lot of the systems we're about to look at kind of blur the lines between these different ideas.
Okay, so we've got the basic concepts down. Let's start our world tour in Section 2 and see how this all plays out in the real world, starting right next door in Canada.
Canada operates on a really sophisticated, layered North American model. It's fundamentally ad valorem, but it's got all these other taxes and fees built in. The annual tax bill is complex because it's usually made up of three main layers.
What are those layers?
So the calculation starts with the market value, which is set by a provincial assessment authority. That's your base.
Right.
Then that value is multiplied by the municipal rate that funds your local police, fire, parks. Then you add an education rate on top of that for the schools. And then finally, you might have some special taxes for specific projects. And on top of all that, how often they reassess your property's value can vary wildly from province to province.
That layering really shows how any budget squeeze, whether it's for schools or for roads, is going to show up on your property tax bill.
Yeah.
But the source material points out this really counterintuitive thing about city tax rates.
Yes, the Vancouver paradox. It's fascinating. Vancouver has some of the highest, most insane property values in the world, right?
But yeah.
But for years, it's had one of the lowest property tax rates in Canada as a percentage of that value.
How is that even possible? It seems like it should be the opposite.
Well, it shows you something really important about how this works. High property values don't automatically mean high tax rates. Think about it. If the city's budget, the actual amount of money they need to run things, stays pretty stable, but the total value of all the property in the city has doubled because of a hot market.
Then you only need to take a much smaller percentage, a smaller slice of that bigger pie, to get the same amount of money.
You've got it. The budget is the constant, and the skyrocketing property values are the variable that actually lets them lower the rate. And it's not just Vancouver. The sources also noted that at one point, Toronto had the lowest rate among all the major cities in its province, Ontario.
So beyond that annual tax, Canada also uses another big levy, the land transfer tax, or LTT.
Yes, and this is a huge part of the cost of buying a home there. The LTT is a provincial tax you pay when you buy a property. So it's a one-time transaction tax, not an annual ownership tax. And it's usually progressive. The more expensive the house, the higher the rate you pay.
And this is everywhere in Canada except for a couple of provinces.
Correct. Alberta and Saskatchewan are the big exceptions. They generally don't have a provincial LTT, which makes buying a home there cheaper upfront.
But the costs can get really, really high in Canada's biggest city.
Oh, absolutely. In Toronto, they have their own additional municipal land transfer tax, which gets stacked right on top of the provincial ones.
So you get hit twice.
You get hit twice. It means buyers in Toronto pay two separate LTTs on one purchase, and it can add tens of thousands of dollars to your closing costs. It's a huge upfront expense.
Wow. That sounds like a major barrier. But the system does try to help out first-time buyers, right?
It does. They use rebates as a policy tool. So in Ontario, for example, first-time home buyers get a tax credit of about $750. But more importantly, there's a land transfer tax rebate of up to $4,000.
So if you're buying a home under a certain price, I think the source said around $368,000, that $4,000 rebate means you pay zero provincial LTT. That's a huge incentive.
It is. But on the other side of the coin, you have British Columbia, which has used property tax surcharges as a really aggressive tool to try and manage foreign investment in its housing market, especially in Vancouver.
Ah, so this is a clear case of using a tax to change behavior. What do?
So British Columbia already has a tiered transfer tax, but then they added a special surcharge that only targets non-resident foreign homebuyers. It started at 15%, and they quickly hiked it to 20%.
20%. On top of everything else.
On top of everything else. And the definition of a foreign buyer is really broad. It even includes international students and temporary foreign workers. It was explicitly designed to cool down foreign speculation in what was an incredibly overheated market.
Okay, so from Canada's layered model, let's jump over to Germany. The problem there wasn't complexity, it was a complete system breakdown that forced a massive reform because of a constitutional ruling.
Right. Germany's property tax brings in almost 15 billion euros a year. It's absolutely vital for their municipalities. It funds schools, libraries, roads, all the local services. It's the bedrock of their local government funding.
But that bedrock was built on, I guess, quicksand. The way they were calculating the tax base was so old it was basically meaningless, which led to this huge constitutional court challenge in 2018.
The whole system was ruled unconstitutional because it violated their version of the Equal Protection Clause. The problem was that the tax calculations were based on standard property values that were decades old.
How old are we talking?
In what was West Germany, they were using values from 1964. In what was East Germany, they were using values from 1935.
35. You can't be serious.
Yeah.
So they're taxing a modern skyscraper based on the value of whatever was on that land before World War II.
That's essentially what was happening. It was stunning, and it created massive inequality. You could have two properties with wildly different modern values paying the exact same tax because their 1935 valuation happened to be the same. The court just said, this is fundamentally unequal and has to stop.
So the court basically ordered a complete reboot of the entire system. That must be a bureaucratic nightmare. What's the timeline for a change that big?
It's a very long, very slow transition. The reform officially kicked in 2022. Then every single property owner in Germany had until January 2023 to submit a massive mandatory reassessment of their property's value based on what it was worth on January 1st, 2022.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. The new taxes based on those new values won't actually be charged until January 1st, 2025.
So from the court ruling in 2018 to the new tax bill in 2025.
Yeah.
That's a 7-year process just to get the new rates in place. That really shows you the scale of this.
Yeah, it really does. And while they were redoing the whole thing, they did keep a lot of the important exemptions for things like public buildings, churches, and nonprofits, as long as the property is being used for a public good. They also gave cities the power to set a higher tax rate on undeveloped land to, encourage construction.
Okay, let's pivot south now to France, which has this really robust, multi-part approach to taxing property.
France's main tax is the taxe foncière. It's a local tax paid by the owner, and it's pretty comprehensive. It's broken into 3 parts. The tax on built properties, like houses, the tax on unbuilt land, like farms, and then a separate tax just for household waste removal.
So they've got you covered whether you own an apartment, a field, or both. But the calculation, this is one of the most conceptually tricky methods we've come across.
It is, because it doesn't use simple market value. For a house, the tax base is 50% of the property's cadastral rental value. For unbuilt land, it's 80% of that value.
Whoa, hold on. What on earth is cadastral rental value? Is that what I could actually rent my house for?
No, and that is the crucial point. It is the theoretical rent the tax authority thinks your property could command based on its characteristics compared to other similar properties. It's a government-determined estimate of potential rent.
So the government dreams up a theoretical rent, and then, for my house, they only tax half of that theoretical number.
That's it. And then that number gets multiplied by a government revaluation coefficient to account for inflation, and then that final number is multiplied by the tax rate set by your local town. It's got all these bureaucratic layers built in.
Which I guess means your tax bill is a lot less volatile than if it was based on the wild swings of the housing market, but it also means there's a lot of government input.
Yes. But the French system is also really notable for its long list of exemptions, which are clearly designed to achieve specific social goals.
Yeah, let's list some of those out because they're perfect examples of policy choices.
So first, you have temporary exemptions to encourage certain things. For instance, new houses are exempt for 2 years. If you do major energy efficiency renovations, you're exempt for 5 years, a clear push for green investment. And new low-income housing projects can get a 15-year exemption.
Those line up perfectly with housing and climate policy. What about permanent exemptions?
The permanent ones cover things like state-owned property and buildings used for religious worship. But the most important one, as a social policy, is that owners over the age of 75 with an income below a certain level are exempt from the taxe foncière for life. It's designed to stop seniors on fixed incomes from being taxed out of their homes.
And just like we saw in Israel, the French system goes after empty homes pretty aggressively with separate taxes.
Oh, yes. They have distinct additional taxes. There's one for furnished secondary residences, and for properties that are just sitting empty, they have 2 levels. One tax for properties in high-demand areas that have been vacant for at least a year, and another one for places that have been empty for more than 2 years. It's a very clear, multi-layered attack on passive property ownership.
Okay. Moving into Section 3, we're shifting away from these traditional ownership models to look at systems that are really different, often with very clear social goals. Let's start with the UK, which is a real anomaly in the developed world.
It is, because the UK is almost unique among wealthy OECD countries for not taxing the ownership of residential property itself. If you own your house, you don't pay an annual tax on the value of that asset, which is a massive break from that ad valorem principle we started with.
So instead, they have the council tax. And that's paid by the person living in the house, not necessarily the owner.
Correct. Council tax is considered a hybrid. It's part property tax, part personal tax. The liability is on the resident. The owner only has to pay if the property is empty, and even then, there are often discounts.
And this is where it gets even more complicated. The amount you pay isn't a percentage of what your house is worth today. It's based on these historical value bands.
Exactly. Your property is put into a council tax band. There are 9 in England, based on what it was worth on a single day back in 1991.
Wait, 1991. So if my house's value has, say, tripled since 1991, I'm getting a huge accidental tax break. Doesn't that completely violate the whole based on value idea?
It creates huge equity problems, yes. It makes the system really out of step with the modern market. It's a common criticism. And the bans are rigid. On top of that, the amount you pay depends on how many people live there. If it's just one person, you get a 25% discount.
The UK also relies heavily on a transaction tax, right? The stamp duty land tax, or SDLT.
SDLT is a big one. It's a progressive tax you pay when you buy property in England and Northern Ireland, and they really use it as a housing policy tool. For a regular UK resident buying their main home, the first £250,000 of the price is tax-free. And for first-time buyers, it's even better. They pay 0% up to £425,000. It's clearly designed to help people get on the property ladder.
And just like we saw in Canada, they use this tax to discourage foreign investors.
They do. Non-UK residents have to pay a 2% surcharge on the SDLT on top of all the other rates. It's a theme we see over and over. If a market gets too hot because of foreign money, transaction taxes are the go-to tool to try and cool it down.
Okay, so from the UK taxing the resident, let's go halfway around the world to Hong Kong, which offers maybe the clearest, most fundamental difference of all the systems we've looked at.
Yeah.
Hong Kong's property tax is just flat out not ad valorem. It's a pure income tax.
This is the critical distinction. The tax is not on the value of the asset. Owners only have to pay property tax if they receive consideration, which just means rental income during the tax year.
So if I own a multi-million-dollar apartment in Hong Kong and I live in it myself, I pay 0 property tax.
Absolutely correct. Because you're not deriving any income from it. The wealth that's tied up in that asset is untouched by this particular tax.
So how do they calculate the tax then?
It's computed on what they call the net assessable value, which is 80% of the assessable value. And the assessable value is basically your total rental income minus any unrecoverable rent and minus any local rates you paid as the owner. It's purely a tax on revenue.
That's a huge difference. It shifts the entire tax burden away from just owning wealth to actually generating income from that wealth.
It's the ultimate contrast to, say, the German or Canadian systems.
Now let's look at Chile, which uses its property tax for something else entirely. Explicit social redistribution. They basically nationalize the tax base to spread wealth between different towns.
Chile's system, the territorial tax, is paid quarterly. It's based on a low percentage, maybe 1 or 2% of the property's fiscal value. And that fiscal value is set by their IRS based on things like construction materials and age, and it's usually much lower than the actual market value.
So the tax burden is already pretty light, but the sources point to these really powerful exemptions designed for social equity.
The exemptions are key. Residential properties valued below about US $40,000 are completely exempt. And for homes valued above that, you only pay tax on the amount that exceeds that $40,000 threshold. It's designed to protect lower value homes and only tax the higher end of the market.
So it's very progressive at the collection point, but the really unique part is what happens to the money after it's collected. It doesn't just stay in the wealthy town where it was raised.
This is the social mechanism that sets Chile apart. While the money initially goes to the local municipality, they have to contribute a big chunk of it to a common municipal fund. This national fund is then redistributed back out to all the municipalities based on need-vin, things like the poverty rate and how much infrastructure they need.
So it basically nationalizes the local tax base. Money from a rich coastal suburb could end up paying for a school or a clinic in a poor rural town.
That's precisely the goal. It's a powerful example of using property tax not just to raise money, but as a deliberate tool for national wealth equalization and to fight regional inequality.
And finally in this section, let's touch on Italy and the pretty confusing history of its local tax structure.
Before 2020, Italy's system was called the Imposta Unica Comunale, or IUC. Now, despite the name Unica, which means single, it was actually this awkward combination of 3 totally separate taxes all bundled together. It was a real headache for homeowners.
To make it clear, the IUC was kind of like having 3 different faucets all flowing into the same sink. What were those 3 components?
The 3 were the IMU, the TASI, and the TARI. The IMU was the basic ownership tax on buildings and land. The TASI was a tax for indivisible services, things like streetlights and road maintenance that benefit everyone, and the TARI was just the tax for garbage collection.
So IMU paid for owning the property, TASI paid for the general upkeep of the town, and TARI paid to take out the trash. A single name for three different calculations.
Exactly, it was a mess. So in 2020, they finally got rid of TASI and rolled it into the new IMU, which simplified things a bit. Today's IMU rates are usually between 0.4% and 0.8% of the property's cadastral value.
And like France, primary residences are often exempt, right?
That's right, your main home is usually exempt from IMU, as is agricultural land that's actively being farmed. But one really interesting thing, given our global topic, is that Italy also has a special wealth tax, the LVIE, that's levied specifically on Italian residents who own real estate abroad.
So they're trying to stop capital flight.
Exactly. It's an aggressive attempt to capture and tax the global assets of their citizens, so wealthy Italians can't just buy property elsewhere to avoid paying tax at home.
That trick around the world really shows that property tax isn't one single thing. It's this incredibly flexible machine. Now let's take a step back in Section 4 and look at the history and the biggest criticisms. It's important to know that this all didn't start with market value, did it? It started with, what, crops?
Oh, absolutely. Before you had widespread currency, tax was just a physical slice of what you produced. We've got records from the ancient city-state of Lagash in modern Iraq from around 6000 BCE. They had a system called bala, which means rotation,
The rotation system.
to make the job of tax collection manageable, because you had to physically go and count everything. They would just tax a different part of the city each month. It was a rotating burden, so the whole city paid over the course of a year. But no single area got crushed by constant collection.
And systems like in ancient Egypt started to move away from just area and towards potential output, towards value.
Yeah, ancient Egypt taxed the value of grain, cattle, oil, and the land itself. And they had a professional class of tax assessors, scribes, who were highly respected. They kept these detailed records of who owned what, and they would check crop yields. If you couldn't pay, you went to court. So it was a slow shift from taxing area to taxing value or income.
Okay, let's fast forward to the American colonial period. Property tax became the foundational tool for building communities.
In the 13 colonies, it was used to fund the most essential services. The Puritans in Boston, for example, used it to pay for the church and for religious education. And everybody had to pay. It didn't matter what your own religion was. It was seen as a civic duty.
And they also built in this measure of social compassion, but also social control that we don't really think about with taxes today.
Not at all. The sources note that the assessors would explicitly consider your social situation. A widow with kids was often not only forgiven her taxes for the year, but she might actually receive a monthly payment from the town treasury.
A kind of guaranteed income funded by property tax.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there were clear punishments. If you destroyed public property, like you damaged a road, you had to pay for the repairs through a direct increase in your property tax. It was a very transparent tool for both welfare and local justice.
Now, after 1776, in the early United States, property tax became the center of this huge political fight between two of the founders, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson.
And this fight really sealed the fate of property tax as a local thing in the U.S. Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government, argued for a high national property tax to give the new federal government more power and more money. Jefferson, who was all about states' rights and local control, wanted that revenue to be raised locally. He saw property tax as the most democratic way for communities to fund themselves.
And Hamilton actually got his national property tax for a little while, right? But it was a total failure. Why?
It was a bureaucratic disaster, and it was deeply unpopular. The states hated the federal government meddling in their local revenue. There were protests, people refused to pay, and it was repealed pretty quickly and never successfully brought back. That failure is why, to this day, property tax in the U.S. is almost exclusively a local revenue stream. It's what pays for our schools, our police, our fire departments.
That history is fascinating. But the most powerful part of this section is the ultimate, fundamental criticism of property tax. It asks this really deep question about what it even means to own something.
The criticism basically asks, does property tax mean that true, absolute ownership of your home is just an illusion?
That's a pretty heavy statement. What's the argument?
The argument is that property tax proves that property owners are really just long-term renters, and the government is the true landlord. And the proof is what happens if you don't pay. Because the government can legally kick you out of your home for not paying this annual fee, your ownership is conditional.
And the consequences for not paying can be incredibly extreme. We have this really shocking, specific story from Southfield, Michigan, that just illustrates the brutal reality of this idea.
This is a well-documented case that really gets to the heart of the criticism. A resident fell behind on her property taxes by about $900. The town, following the law, refused to accept a late payment after a certain point. Instead, they confiscated her home, which is valued at nearly $300,000, and sold it to cover the debt.
Wait, they took a $300,000 home over a $900 debt.
They did, and it highlights the most severe implication for property rights. The value of the asset they took was wildly out of proportion to the debt owed, but the state's right to collect its tax and the lien that comes with it was more powerful than the individual's claim to her own home. Critics say this is definitive proof that your ownership is contingent on paying that annual fee to the state. It changes how you see the whole thing.
It really does. It's not just a tax, it's the annual renewal fee on your tenancy with the government.
And just to round out the picture, even though this tax is so common, it's worth noting there are some surprising places that don't have it at all on residential property.
It's a surprisingly long list for such a fundamental tax. Who are the big exceptions?
Well, in the People's Republic of China, there's no tax on homeowners because the government technically owns all the land. We also see no property tax in places like Kuwait, Malta, and Greenland.
And even inside the U.S. sphere of influence, there are some tax-free zones.
Yes. The U.S. territory of American Samoa has no property tax. And even in a state like Alaska, only about 24 municipalities actually levy one. But where they do, it makes up the vast majority of local revenue, which shows you just how effective this tax is when it's applied.
This has been a really fascinating and, I think, exhaustive breakdown. It shows property tax is a financial tool, it's a social lever, and it's a bit of a philosophical hot potato.
Yeah.
Let's try and synthesize the two big takeaways from this deep dive.
I think the first one is that property tax, even though we think of it as this simple local thing, is incredibly adaptable. We saw systems where it works like an income tax, like in Hong Kong,
Right.
or a tax on residence, like in the UK, or even a national wealth redistribution tool, like in Chile. Its application is always a policy choice, whether you're trying to equalize wealth or just get landlords to rent out empty apartments, like in France and Israel.
And the second big takeaway is that despite all that global variety, its core function at the local level is still absolutely fundamental. It is, for lack of a better term, the cost of local civilization. I mean, in the U.S., it's the engine that funds 97% of local infrastructure, police, fire, schools, roads. You just can't run a city without it.
It is the necessary engine of local government. But let's end with that really provocative thought that the critics raised, building on that example from Michigan, where a $900 debt led to losing a $300,000 home. If failing to pay your property taxes, even a tiny amount, can lead to the state taking and selling your home, does that mean true absolute property ownership is fundamentally an illusion?
Are we at best just long-term tenants of the state paying an annual rent on the land? It's a powerful question. And it challenges the very core of our ideas about property rights. It really encourages us to look seriously at those other ideas we mentioned, like Georgism and the land value tax, as maybe potential solutions. Understanding the history and the philosophy behind that annual bill, it really changes everything about how you read it next time it shows up in your mailbox.